Really, really exciting to have everybody here. Sprints with Evan, we're trying to kick it off. For those of you who are in attendance on this last one, I know it was Reza and myself. We really dove into the operational elements of creative workflow, structure, all that kind of stuff. And we're hoping to make this a series. So for this one here, we have a good friend of mine, and I will share my screen. When I say good friend, Josh and I have known each other not for very long, so I don't know if good friend is the correct terminology there, but essentially him and I have known each other for might actually be coming up on like 6 to 8 months or something like that. But basically ever since him and I started talking, like I could see that his skill level was next level, and it's something that I admired. So just the way that he was able to conduct his of course, like media buying chops, the creative strategy side of things, and how he managed internal and external clients, like I think that's something to admire. So I'm super excited to have Josh here to really dive into like what it looks like and what it means for a creative strategy to be involved in the media buying process. And just so I can put some respect on Josh's name, just because I know everyone might not know who he is, let me give like the official intro for him. So Josh on this end, he is a senior director, a recent senior director at WPromote. He does this thing, managing a ton of clients, has a large team. From a spend perspective, over 150 million a year. So he does what he has to do. And then from a size of client perspective, it really spans the gambit, right? From those small clients to those larger clients. So that expertise level spans across those basic needs. And why I'm really happy to have Josh here to be part of this conversation is not only does he bring like that agency knowledge that I think like is always helpful because you're exposed to so many different things, but for everyone who's in the room from a brand perspective, this will also give you an element and like insight into what's going on in different pieces, because as you know, at agencies, you're an extension of the brands you work with. And if you work with a ton, you are a massive extension. So that's Josh, everybody. Give it up for him in the chat. Give it up for him in the chat. Super excited to have him here. Amazing. But now to kick it off and like, why are we actually here for this conversation? And I think like from the title, everybody knows that the media buying landscape has ultimately changed, right? At Motion, I'm hoping most people know what we're about, where it's really focused on the creative strategy side of things. And why, again, I'll always say good things about Josh, but what I also really like about the WPromote team in general is that they're almost the company that's that's termed the term of performance creative. So they have an entire team that's dedicated to like really optimizing on the direct response side of things. And they've been able to build a lot of content around it and speak quite highly about it. So that's why I'm also really excited to share that perspective. But Josh, I definitely don't want to be doing the primary amount of talking. We need to pick your brain on what's happening here. So if you can, let's kick us off. Like talk to us a little bit about like the current landscape and how it's changed over the short period of time, but just even like since you've been doing it.
Yeah, thanks for that introduction, Evan. I'll try to live up to those expectations that you just set. But yeah, to start things off, I mean, if you've been a media buyer, especially in the last year and two, but even longer than that, if you've been in the industry for the last 5 to 6 years, there's been quite a bit of change. But one of the biggest changes obviously was the rollout and this post iOS 14.5 like landscape that we now find ourselves in. It's really just caused a lot of disruption across the board. And it's not the first time something like this has happened, right? There was the GDPR rollout, 2016 had Cambridge Analytica, and there were like changes that we had to adapt to in the way that we buy media when all those things occurred. The iOS 14 one was definitely the biggest probably impact that I've seen in my time of working in the paid social landscape, but I don't think it will be the last, right? So as data privacy continues to kind of tighten, and rightfully so, we as media buyers really just have to adjust to these changes, right? And that really requires us to be very agile about how we operate and how we buy media. And one of the most agile things that we need to kind of approach in this scenario is our creative, right? So consistently testing and iterating and seeing which best practices still work and seeing which ones pretty much are just fallen to the wayside. Because that digital marketing landscape is pretty volatile right now, it really requires a lot of agility in how we're buying media and how we're making changes, and then how we're implementing them on a larger scale across different clients, across different ideas, different channel teams. So a lot of the media buying now has really shifted into this concept of like maximizing event signals, right? Leaning into the algos, leaning into the AIs, and really trying to maximize the impact that those AIs can continue to learn from, which then hopefully finds the ideal customer in an e-commerce sense, or lead in a B2B sense for a specific client or company. So when I think of maximizing signals, it's really about how we continue to stabilize in a volatile environment, and then how we continue to test and iterate too. So when the 80% of what we're using to stabilize becomes performance is dipping, maybe we have that testing strategy, right, that we can continue to find out what maybe is working now that we can adapt on a larger scale without being too disruptive. So in the scheme of it all, it's maximizing signals and leaning into the AI tools, and then consistently being agile in our testing methodology to see what's changing in this landscape. So I would say it's going to continue to change, but those philosophies and concepts are something I really hold true, and that like WPromote, I know, and across the team that I work with and across the agency, I know we're really big on just being like quick to change. We're not like stuck in any ways, because that's where you kind of get left in the dust. And specifically in creative, the way that creative looks now from where we are today versus where we were like 5 years ago, of like the static imageries and these static carousels, it's completely shifted, right? Like the focus is heavily on video, and what about video are we focusing on? And that's kind of where we're evolving and learning right now.
Yeah, most definitely. No, very well said. And like from my end, I also come from a media buying background, but I was very lucky. Most of my buying was done prior to iOS 14, right? So what that means is I had the luxury of really being able to swap a couple audiences and make those changes within platform to really just be able to see performance scale. And a lot of this effort now that we're talking about creative strategy is more of like a new concept and requirement. So like, Josh, as you say all those things, one of the big thing that comes to mind for me is that like, why do media buyers now have to think about creative strategy? And can it be someone else? Should it be someone else? Or do you think it should be like really a tool on the toolkit of a media buyer?
I mean, I think it's almost becoming a requirement of a toolkit for media buyers, because creative plays such an impactful and big role in the ad buying process, right? It becomes necessary for at least media buyers to understand creative concepts, how to test creative, and how to kind of work it into the framework of what we're doing. Because whether it's on paid search or programmatic or Amazon, or specifically on social media platforms, creative is like the backbone of a lot of that, right? It's catching people. It's giving people, if they don't know your brand already, it's giving them your brand impression. Maybe it's the first time, maybe it's a recurring brand impression, but it's really building the story and narrative. And along with other creative elements, whether it's ad copy, text overlays, landing page experiences, creative plays a very huge piece in the puzzle of media buying these days.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. And like anyone who's talked to me knows I talk about this in the sense of hats, right? And I say hats because ultimately the creative strategy role is a role by itself. It's very necessary and people can hold that role, right? But at the same time, like with this environment that's changing, like we need to be collaborative in that sense. So it's like Josh is definitely a media buyer. He does his thing there and he does a million other things too, but he also wears that hat of creative strategy, which drives a lot of that forward. But I think like the funny part that's also attached to this is sure, like media buying, creative strategy, technical in platforms, we know what's going on, but like we're so reliant at the end of the day on the creative end, meaning what's developed, what goes into the account, and what ultimately launches. So talk to me a little bit about like, I don't know, there's a bunch there, right? So let's unpack it. Talk to me a little bit about like a disconnect that can occur between like media buyers and creative teams. Talk to me about how important education is and stuff like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just like if you were talking to somebody who might speak a different language, there's almost a language gap, right? Like I look at it in the same sense of, when we're working with tech teams or digital intelligence teams, right? We're trying to bridge a language gap of talking about technical solutions and implementations in the media buying, right? And we're speaking from the media buying side and they might be speaking from the tech side, right? And creative kind of lives in the same capacity. We're talking about it from a media buying side, and our creative partners are talking about it from the creative side, right? And it's how do we break down those language barriers that exist between these teams? And really, the backbone of it is communication and data and visualization, and really just talking about the best way to iterate, right? So because it's such a massive component now of the ad buying process, that symbiotic relationship between creative teams and media buyers, becomes important. So it's almost like media buyers have to wear the creative cap, right? And creative teams and creative team members almost have to wear like a data analysis cap now. And that's kind of our blend between the two kind of broken down communication barriers that tend to exist. And from the media buying side, it's really communication of how we're testing, how we're iterating, what are the concepts, and it's a partnership with the creative teams to discuss what hypotheses do we want to test, how we roll out the paid media, and really just how we kind of theorize what we can do next and communicating in a way that is digestible for both teams, right? So we're not getting too into the weeds of this number is outperforming this number by X amount, therefore we need to do this, but saying like, hey, when we're rolling with a video that's 15 seconds versus 30 seconds, we seem to drive better click-through rates and conversion rates down the funnel. So let's invest in more of that and like theorize on maybe what concepts we're putting in those 15-second videos. And then from the creative lens, it's understanding that we're not rolling out all the creative that comes into play across the board on like our paid media buying, because we're still trying to maximize the signals that I talked about before. So we need to roll it out and test and see what works, and then drop what's working into kind of our what I would call our evergreen structure, right? Where we have stabilized KPIs, we have efficiencies that we can continue to maximize. And it's kind of that symbiotic flow between the relationship between the two teams where, creative teams maybe are hypothesizing on creative strategies and they're working with media buying teams to kind of combine those hypotheses so we can essentially, whether it's for a client, whether it's in-house, be testing these theories in a structured capacity that's not going to have too big of an impact on performance.
Awesome. Okay. Amazing, Josh. Thanks for introducing this with me, man. Like, I think like ultimately there are three big things that we went through there, right? Like, how come media buyers need to think about creative strategy? What's that disconnect look like between media buyers and creatives? And then more importantly, like moving forward, what does this start to look like? So before we dive into like the meat and potatoes of what we're going to chat about today, essentially, I just wanted to just really outline what creative strategy is starting to look like, right? And we got some foolish emojis here to really tell that story, but really what we have going on is a couple of different situations, right? Like when we talked about the first situation of media buyers and creative strategists holding different roles, they're still side by side in the approach they have to take. And Josh has outlined exactly why that's important. But for today's call, the main thing that Josh and I will be focusing on is a situation similar to this. So someone who's holding a media buying like hat, as well as a creative strategy hat. And what does that look like? And everybody who's here, if you ever have any questions about what like just additional pieces you want to tack onto or whatever's going on, please just throw it into the chat. You can either use the chat function. My preference is Q&A, so throw it into the Q&A tab, but we'll be able to get to it if it flows in naturally to what we're talking about, or we'll just get to it right at the end. Amazing. Okay, so why this is all important before we dive into like media buying and creative strategy life, just so I can put a definition on like creative strategy and how we think about it specifically, is usually with creative strategy, it's the person who's digesting the information from platform, understanding what's happening, and then helping develop what's ultimately needed next based on that data, right? And usually what that means from an output perspective, in its like simplest form, is you're helping to contribute to some sort of brief and like the requirement there. So when we're talking about creative strategy, like this is the ultimate output and lens that's also associated with there. But I'm sure Josh is going to drop a lot of gems on us on how that also comes to life. But without further ado, I know we're here to talk about creative strategy, but at the same time, like we have an A1 day one media buyer in the house. So I can't get away without asking a couple of like straight media buying questions, technical side of things, Josh. Okay. So I think like the first thing I'm curious about, and I know it's more open-ended than anything, let me know if you need me to guide you with any follow-ups here, but just like walk us through the day in the life of Josh as the media buyer when you hop into the account. Like, what are you looking at? How are you optimizing? That kind of stuff.
Yeah, happy to walk through it. And I would say my days right now are as agile as the media landscape that we work in, right? So I try to go where I'm needed. I'm lucky and fortunate enough to have a very amazing team of media buyers who I work with that are truly the backbone of everything we do, right? So my job is really to support them wherever and whenever they need it. And as we work on an array of different clients, right? Every day tends to really vary. So some days I might be in there helping build ads or QAing ads or, pulling reports and navigating that. Other days, we might be not navigating a large measurement and tech discussions and implementations. I might be helping team members guide discussing opportunities on new platforms, discussing creative and strategies behind that, and how we think about testing and implementing these strategies on a day-to-day basis. So really, it does tend to vary, right? Like it might be supporting team members in capacities that are much more high level, where it's like presenting to clients and presenting ideas and just fine tuning strategies and how we communicate it. Other days, and my personal belief is like, no one's above any work. Some days it's just going in, doing the ad operational skills, right? Building the ads, making tweaks to budgets, adjusting creative where it needs to be. Maybe it's bringing a testing piece of creative into our evergreen campaigns and pausing down some underperforming ones. So my day tends to vary pretty significantly, but it ranges from everything from ad building to like large social team ideas and kind of iterating on those concepts and making sure that my team that I work with feels empowered to have those discussions with clients and with other internal stakeholders.
That's awesome. Yeah, the flexibility in everyone's life, I think, is something that we all have to be able to just tackle so many things, but having that focus is also important. So I love how you broke it down for us. Let's talk to the people in the room who are like agency related, starting at a new job, or people who just need fresh eyes on their account, right? So when you're first looking at an account, like let's say you're onboarding it for the first time, like what are some of the like things you're looking at when you go through the account? Meaning, what's your preferred structure and anything else you're willing to share?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things I try to do is identify, like, from whether it's a client or whether it's, if it's in-house, the exec team, really what the goals are that they're looking to achieve this year, what kind of brand they are, like what are their brand props, what are they value props that they're utilizing, who their competitors are, and where they see themselves in the market. So then I start to get a good idea of, does the strategy that's in place align with where they believe they are and how we're positioning the brand in our paid media. Once I kind of get that understanding of it, then it's kind of like, auditing and checking through the account, right? Like one of the biggest things that I find is there's a lot of disruptions when it comes to how creative's rolled out, where everything gets paused down when new creative comes in and everything gets launched. But that's not necessarily the best approach. And it actually is more impactful to kind of do it in like different flows without disrupting the algorithm as much. But the other thing that I try to really hone in on when I'm kind of QAing and like looking through a new account or for clients that might be coming on is naming convention consistency. Do they have a consistency with the naming convention that makes sense, that flows all the way from the campaign level to the ad level? Because when it comes to pulling data and reports and trying to automate a lot of that, and especially analyzing creative, if your naming conventions aren't in line, you're going to be screwed, because like you'll never truly be able to compare and contrast and move around variables to identify what's working and what's not. So naming conventions usually is where I start with. And then I like to see like, where's their overlap, right? Are they breaking things out? What audiences are they targeting? How are they breaking out their funnel, right? Is it prospecting and retargeting? Is there retention plays? And I look for how they structure the account in regards to where the customer journey is, and are we meeting that customer journey with the ads that we're serving in that part of the funnel, right? So thinking about sequencing and how we tell a brand narrative across kind of the funnel. So holistically, that's really where I start to look at is, understanding the client's goals or the executive team's goals and their brand, and then seeing if it aligns with the campaign structure and strategy. Then it's like diving into creatives, right? Like, are we leveraging enough video utilization? Or is it still heavily focused on static, right? What other platforms are we using, and what's happened with platform costs over a period of time, and where are there other opportunities potentially to expand and lower platform costs?
Yeah.
And then it's kind of diving into like audiences and audience strategies, and are we over segmented? Are we consolidated in certain areas and not in others? Are we maximizing event signals, or are we stuck in the learning phase or learning limited due to changes? So when I'm identifying that, those are like the key things I look for. I kind of list them out and I do like an audit doc, and then I start chipping away at the things I think would be most impactful to the business without being disruptive to what's currently doing, and slowly phasing these things in over time.
Most definitely. Josh, you just hit him with so much information, and we got to unpack that for him. Okay, so
All
there's a
right, let's
bunch
get
of
after it.
different there's a bunch of different buckets that fell in there. And like the very first thing that I wanted to tackle was like specifically naming conventions. And
Yeah,
Bren jumped in the chat too, was asking about like granularity. How granular are you going? And just to tack onto that, like on my end, how are you initially determining like what your structure and convention should look like, and how frequently are you going back to like say, hey, we need to add an influencer name, for example, or something else?
yeah. So going back, I'll do it from time to time, but a lot of, especially if you're using third-party analytics tools, GA, Adobe, or any other kind of third-party platform, when you're running an ad for a long period of time and say you're using like dynamic UTMs, if you have an ad name and you change it in there, it won't retroactively go back and update it unless it's a new ad. So there's things like that where it's like, I try to be as upfront with the naming convention as possible, so that when we're making new ads and we're creating and we're kind of understanding the data, whether it's comparing platform data to GA or Adobe data, we kind of get that full visualization without trying to like piecemeal together like what the ad was called before versus now. And when it comes to granularity, that's a great question. I think granularity is extremely important at the ad level, specifically for understanding what data you want to break out. I would get as granular as you can, usually like signaling like what kind of asset you're using, whether it's a static, whether it's a video, whether it's a video carousel, etc. Signals for different ad copy, headlines, body copy, landing pages, whether it's influencer creatives or non-influencer creatives, if that's something that a team's utilizing. The more granular you can get, it might be a lot of upfront work in regards to the ad operations and naming it, but it makes like pulling data super easy, right? And then you can automate all that through different API connections. So the upfront work is to save the backend data of like, hey, how are longer form videos performing against short term? And if you don't have that in the naming convention and you're having to go through every individual ad and see how long it is, that's going to take forever, right? So by anything that you think you'd be comparing from a creative lens at the ad level, if you start up front with naming it, you'll be able to kind of utilize that in your analysis and how you're comparing and contrasting. So in regards to creative analysis and reporting, naming conventions are the backbone of that, right? And consistency there across and even across the funnel is super important.
And I think where I can jump in there too, it's just like on my end, my preference, because I have the privilege of working with a ton of different teams on the stuff that they want to look at. And like, I'm definitely an 8 to 9 variable kind of guy of what's being included. And just for everyone who is in attendance, what we can do is we've built a naming convention template so people can see exactly what we're thinking about. And then Josh, you have any 2 cents after, you can also add a little bit of your insight too. Does that sound okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's do it. Okay, so hold on. There's still a couple other pieces in there that I wanted to unpack. We also have another question from Jake just in the Q&A there. But Jake, hold on 1 second. I promise I'm going to get there in a second. But the one thing that I wanted to know is like you were talking very much about those campaign structures from a media buying perspective. You're looking for audience overlap. You're looking for just like the what are they optimized for? All of that kind of stuff. So on your end, do you have a preferred structure that you look at for your accounts? Is it like, you know what, I'm not even running retargeting. I want full funnel stuff, this many ad sets, this many ads, or are you more dynamic, and what's the thought process if so?
I think that varies on a, client by client, or it varies based on like what the goals are, right? I try to get everything consolidated as much as possible. So then we have evergreen and then we have testing, right? And those two things can kind of live separately in the ecosystem of like how we're kind of going about making and implementing changes. When I think of like a structure, for the most part, I like to break it down into like a prospecting, or retargeting, and a retention, right? And then those could be broken down more granular based on, what kind of retention efforts you're kind of going after, what that retention and lifetime value cycle looks like, and how you can kind of use that and optimize that to get people back into the funnel. But when it comes to prospecting and retargeting, I've seen it vary, right? I have some clients who are really just leveraging like low intent retargeting signals, like add to carts and view content, and that's really all the retargeting they're doing. And I have others who have it more broken out, right, where they're going after website views and engagement in their retargeting pools, and then prospecting is excluding those. So when I think about how that's shaped, there's also a theory, and there's also things that we're doing where we're running prospecting campaigns that are capturing a lot of that retargeting audience, right? And that we're using that to leverage and maximize signals. So I think that strategy can vary, and it's something that you just kind of have to test out, right? And like how much you consolidate versus how much you segment out, especially in retargeting. That's a big topic of conversation, is what is the right level of segmentation within the retargeting campaigns to maximize the impact of your campaigns. And that tends to vary on a client by client basis. So it's really important to kind of test that and see what fits best for that client. From the prospecting side, it's a pendulum right now, right? Like pre-iOS, like interest audiences and lookalikes were super heavily utilized. And then after the rollout of like iOS 14.5, like that pendulum swung towards broad audiences even more, right? And maximizing those broad audiences and really kind of leaning into like larger audience pools to give the algorithm more room to operate. But if a lot of changes are going on in those audiences, you're sending that back into the learning phase, and that can be disruptive. So overall, in prospecting, that pendulum's like swinging back, right? We've started to see lookalikes doing better at times, interest audiences doing better at times. So I think because of the volatile environment, especially on the paid social side, it requires a lot of like consistent testing too at the audience level and at the creative level, because not all creative is going to resonate with the broad audience. Maybe you're testing it against interest audiences and different things like that. And all that can be learned in your kind of testing methodology and sandbox that's separate and outside of like what you'd establish as your evergreen campaigns.
Yeah, gotcha. Quick follow-up from my end, because I'm just curious. Yeah. Budget splits. Is there a typical like percentage of your overall budget that you're allocating towards your testing?
Yeah, I mean, off the cuff, I usually would say like an 80% evergreen, 20% testing split. Now, I think that should be a variable number and should range between, 10 to like 10% testing, 90%, all the way up to, 30 and potentially even like 35% testing versus evergreen. Because one of the things that I, talk about with creative teams and different clients is like, if the testing is working in the testing campaign, we shouldn't minimize it. We should try to maximize what it's doing in the testing campaign to see how far we can push that creative, and how high we can scale it and stay efficient if it's above, let's say a benchmark return on ad spend of $3. And you have this benchmark return on ad spend of $3, so you're driving a 6 in testing. Let's keep scaling that up, right? So it might go above 20%, and maybe if it's performing bad, maybe you start to pull back, right? So for me, I think it should be a sliding scale based on that. And I'd like to push, especially when creative is working, I like to push it in those testing campaigns too, because it seems to have found and resonated with an audience. And then what I can do is take that solid piece of creative that's working in testing, start to roll it into my evergreen and phase out the underperformers there.
Love it. I think this really speaks to the dynamic nature of like what media buying looks like now, right? Because like at the end of the day, you can have your structure, but you don't want to like turn something off that's ultimately working well. And like, that's what I'm hearing across the board, right? So in terms of questions, we have one more for you that I'm also gonna pack in with Jake's, who had asked it into the Q&A, just on the media buying side, but I wanna make sure we tackle creative strategy. Like that's what the majority of people are definitely here for. So on the media buying front, like one of the last things you said in the statement was just around like, hey, I'm looking to build efficiencies in the account where there might not be, but I'm also looking to look at those buying signals. So the question from Jake is unpack the concepts and tools of buying signals. And then on my end, talk to me how that also ties into like the efficiency and how you're creating those efficiencies.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll start with like, when I'm analyzing creative, the KPIs that we're looking at, right? And this is going to vary by product in an e-commerce lens, right? You might have a product that sells for $100. You might have a product that sells for $2,000. So the certain signals you might use might change a little bit. But some of the key ones from the creative side to see if creative is working well is click-through rates, thumb stop ratios, and engagement rates, right? You're looking at those metrics to see, are people stopping to see your ad? And I know, Evan, you give the perfect run through of the thumb stop ratio at 3 seconds. Is that drawing your attention or is it not, right? And really that's an indicator to me of like, okay, that's something we can iterate on from the creative lens. Click-through rates are another big one for me that I really tend to hone in on. And I compare and contrast those against a couple of different, like, I guess like, and I'll talk in like a bottom funnel sense right now, some bottom funnel metrics, right? So looking at conversion rates. looking at ROAS or CPA, depending on what your goals might be in an e-commerce lens, could be CPL if it's a B2B client. And then also AOVs, right? Like what creative's driving a higher average order value or a lower average order value. So I'm comparing and contrasting those to try to find which ones have high thumb stop and conversion rates, high click-through rates and conversion rates, and identifying those as like some top performing iterations. The other thing is, say you do have a client that, or say you have a product that is a $2,000 price point or higher, right? You might not get enough signals from the purchase signal to garner good results with, unless you're spending like a lot of money. So also moving those conversion rate signals up the funnel to see what add to cart conversion rates might be, even view content conversion rates, right? Like how many people are adding to a cart, and then also comparing and contrasting like the different conversion rates as they move through that funnel. So when I'm looking at creative, I'm trying to look from the lens of when they're on the platform and how they're interacting with the ad, to what's it encouraging them to do when they get to the landing page and start moving through that funnel, because then we can kind of start to iterate on two different concepts: the creative that's in play versus the landing page experiences and kind of the native site experiences that we might be kind of walking through as a customer. So I try to put the lens of like the person buying the product or submitting the lead and understand like where those breakoffs might be, and then identifying the points with the creative that we can improve, that we can start testing, right? And we can test those different theories against each other in that kind of environment.
To get personal, I love how there's like in marketing, you're required to put yourself in the shoes of who you think your customer is, right? In everything, right? And like that's a skill that is helpful literally in every step of your life. So I really like that. There's more questions that are starting to flow in. I think what we're going to do now is just hold off to the last 15 minutes, because let's get to some of these creative strategy questions now. So
Totally.
With that hat of creative strategy on, I want to come back to like when you're entering an account for the first time, or like with a new fresh pair of eyes, right? We talked a lot about like media buying and what you're looking at there, but talk to me how you're like unpacking and getting caught up to speed on like the creative side of things, like what's resonating, how are you tracking themes, concepts, and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So when I'm identifying creative and I'm starting to like analyze an account for what creative is active and what they've previously done, first thing I look at is just like static versus video utilization, right? And I think one of the historical things, and one thing we see kind of often, is still lower like utilization of video, and or overutilization of video too in that same regard, right? Where it's almost 95% video and 5% static, or 90% static and 10% video. There needs to be a mix, right? Because the more creative that like variations, like a static and a video, and like it allows it to serve in different placements, which will lower your costs. And it's all about meeting the right person at the right time and being there for that journey as they kind of, go through the customer cycle. So for me, the big thing is looking static versus video, right? And what the utilization rates are there. The second thing I try to identify and look at is there sequencing, right? Are you talking to somebody who might not know your brand or has never heard of you in the same way you're talking to somebody you're trying to get to purchase again? And if so, what can we do to start sequencing the customer experience of somebody who's maybe been a visitor and who's purchased versus somebody who might not be familiar with the brand, and how we leverage creative and copy and themes for different people at different points in that customer journey. And so those are some of the two big things I look at. And then I'll start going in and kind of start understanding the themes of the creative and what's going on. Is the theme of the videos, are they all the same? And if they are all the same, has anything else been tested against those like themes? Whether maybe it's one value prop, right? Or maybe it's one kind of text overlay with a certain messaging. And have they tested other value props? If not, can we? So I try to identify things that are in the creative as well that we could test and iterate against, especially for the things that aren't working, right? So the creative variations that are going well, then I'll take those examples and bring them to the table. It's like, let's get more of this, but let's test these value props on it. Right. Or let's test like this video concept with what we're doing over here, because this seems to be working really well, and see if it's the video or the concept, whether it's the message or the music or the different elements of the creative that aren't working, or is it the value prop in it? So when I'm looking through an account from the creative lens, that's really what I'm trying to identify. What's working, what's not, what's the utilization, and where can we start to start chipping away at hypotheses and theories with creative teams to strategize on to improve performance.
Amazing, amazing. And I think just so we can put some metrics to it, because I'm assuming we have a ton of media buyers in the house. One of the things too is when we are evaluating that creative to say it is good or not, what metrics do you care about when you're evaluating?
Yeah, and those metrics are going to vary by client goal, right? So in an e-commerce lens, really what I'm looking at is conversion rates, return on ad spends, and different ones like that compared to click-through rates or video view rates, right? Or video, I guess thumb stop ratio is probably the one I'd prefer in the video sense. And video view rates are great though. But I do think thumb stop ratios and click-through rates from the creative lens, and then comparing and contrasting it against conversion rates and ROAS on those same ads. And then as a secondary metric, I'll look at AOVs in an e-commerce lens as well, because I think that matters if you have varying price points for your product. Which ones drive higher AOVs versus smaller AOVs? And even thinking about that and what products we're leveraging in our creative to drive higher AOVs. So that's kind of one of the key points, when I'm thinking about that I start identifying with metrics are pretty much those. If it's a B2B, it's more cost per lead metrics, right? And cost per the conversion rate of a lead. Kind of like I mentioned before, sometimes I'll even look at add to cart conversion rates as a secondary signal if there's just not a lot of volume of purchases.
Most definitely. And I think this is me, myself and Josh have worked together a lot on this kind of stuff too. So as he brings up images and videos, there's also the metrics that vary depending on those, right? When we're talking videos, as Josh had mentioned, thumb stop is letting us know right at the top of funnel what's going on. Then we build our funnel. Then we want to look at our through plays to see how many people are getting the 15 seconds. We can also use the percentage breakdowns if we'd like. And then more importantly, we then have to look at how's that experience from creative to landing page. So filtering it out that way can give you all of the metrics like Josh has just spoken about there. But something else, Josh, that comes to mind to me is I'm just trying to understand with that creative strategy hat on, what are some of the tasks that you ultimately take on? So what I mean by that, one question I have for you is related to you know how you put yourselves in the shoes of the person who's going to be signing up or buying? Are you working with brands to be able to persona build and these are the value props associated with personas? Or is that something that,
yeah, I mean, it really depends on what level of, interaction we get with the creative teams. And I think there is a level of persona building of how we do that. Now, in the lower funnel kind of retargeting sense, there's less of the persona building, and that's much more for the, prospecting or upper funnel play. But yeah, it's putting that kind of consumer hat on, and with creative strategists partnering together on what hypothesis we can test from that consumer hat lens, where if I'm a consumer and the perfect example is we're coming up on the summer, right? And there's a lot of companies launching summer attire and swimwear. And when we're thinking of it, it's what kind of messaging is going to resonate? What kind of color schemes and SKUs should we feature? What is the messaging that we're trying to relay to someone who doesn't know the brand versus knows the brand? And as we put that consumer hat on, it's, working with that creative team to form on a hypothesis of on a sprint scale, what are we testing, right? Well, we're going to test different flat lays, different product SKU features, different things like that in sprints. But what's a larger hypothesis and theme that we could test maybe for a month, right? Maybe for a month, we're focusing on one value prop versus another value prop in all of our creative sprints that we're doing on a weekly or bi-weekly basis. So we have these small micro learnings of what kind of features in the ad work well, and then we have the macro lens of what's the larger hypothesis here on while we're making all these micro kind of adjustments into tweaks to see what specifics in the creative are resonating best. There's a larger hypothesis to it too of what are the value props that are consistently performing better, or what are the the backgrounds or the themes that are consistently in play that we're kind of moving against. So I like to think of it like when I'm working with creative strategists is like there's like our sprints and our kind of like short kind of cycle, and then our long cycle like learnings that we're trying to develop. And really it's just a symbiotic partnership with those teams of like, even thinking like the next quarter out or the next season out, what do we want to test next before they get into photo shoots, before they're getting into a lot of the essentially the filming and the creation of these ads. So it's a lot of like early on hypothesizing and then running it into the market and then making tweaks and adjustments based on what was shot in like little changes within the videos or the images or the creatives that we're like working with.
Gotcha. Yeah. The dynamic element again come into play on depending on whatever the requirement is. So something that comes to mind for me is so much related to there's so much data within the account, so it's easy to get lost in the sauce. I think one part that a lot of people are strong at are able to identify like where is action required. It's not always easy to know like what that action is, but it's like where do we need to do something, right? But my question is more related like now you know where to action. We actually have to bring this stuff to a different team. Like a creative team needs to produce something that's going to meet that need, right? So on your end, like one, how are you making sure that those tests you're running aren't like too lost in the sauce and giving them too much information? And then two, how are you relaying that information in a digestible way?
Yeah, great point, right? Analysis paralysis is like what I've heard it called and what I like to call it, where there's just so much damn data and you're staring at it and getting lost and like, well, these are like your highest performing, but the click-through rates are lower. So like what is really working? We've all been there. And I think one of the most difficult things that as media buyers that, we tend to do because we're in that day-to-day, we're analyzing that and making optimizations and changes is when we're working with other teams, we get very data heavy, right? So one of the things that we do, and especially now since partnering with you and your team over at Motion, is we try to keep it pretty like cut and dry, right? We have our creative tests that we're running. We're using Motion to put the visuals behind and showcase the creatives that can click right through to the preview links, and we can, help them visualize it. And we can show our top performing and we can show our bottom performing. And then essentially from there, with those Motion reports, we just call out like the difference between those two, right? So maybe you're running two different video variations. One's a 30-second, one's a 15 second. That's a pretty easy call out, right? Like 15-second performed better than this. And the hypothesis is that like, and the reason why is because, the video scroll through rates, the intro seemed to just catch better and people were, more responsive to it. But when you have, let's say, 8 different things that you're like testing, like different, maybe it's a different product creative, but there's a theme, right? Maybe a text overlay versus a no text overlay, or a value prop 1 versus value prop 2 over different products. Then what we can do is, this is where Motion really comes in handy, is you can see your top performers and your bottom performers, right? And we can showcase the ones that are doing best. And you find your top 2 and your bottom 2, and you say, hey, the top 2 both had value prop 1 and drive high click-through rates and conversion rates, whereas the bottom 2 had value prop 2 and didn't perform as well. And then what we can also do is filter, and this is where naming conventions really come into play. You can filter for the different value props to see which value prop performed better, because maybe value prop 1 did better with one product and value prop 2 did better with another. So when it comes to that, it's storytelling, right? And it's building a narrative that's understandable and digestible, because if you're just reading off data, like here's the ROAS for this, here's the AOV for this, it's going to get lost and you're going to see everyone's eyes glaze over and be like, I don't really have any takeaways from that. So what I like to do is kind of use those Motion reports and take screenshots of them to showcase like the data and the chart at the top. And then I have a quick takeaway at the bottom. This ad's doing well, this one's not. Let's iterate on this one because it's a top performer and see if we can make it improve it even better.
Awesome. Yeah, simplicity makes sense. I have a bunch of other questions that I could pick your brain with, but I think what I really want to do is get to some of the questions that people have for us. So I know there's a bunch that are kind of floating into either the chat or the Q&A. We'll start in the Q&A, just keeping an eye that we have 12 minutes left here. But someone is asking, in retargeting, do you notice that larger audiences perform better? What's the audience size cutoff? we're testing, and you can see this too, and everybody can. So
Yeah.
there we go.
I mean, it varies, right? I have ones where we've gone very broad now with our retargeting, and those audience sizes can range, between anywhere from 100,000 to 500,000. So with those, sometimes it performs better, but I've also found when I've narrowed some retargeting windows again, I've seen some strong performance there. So really it's just testing. And an easy way to do that would just kind of be setting up like a split test of one, that has a highly consolidated retargeting window. And then in the other split test in that cell, it would be your kind of broken out ones, and see like what overall does best, right? Now, naturally, we know that Facebook, and if we're talking about social platforms, Facebook tends to push spend towards the higher audience sizes at times in the retargeting. So that's going to take a lot of kind of maybe manual levers of pulling budgets and allocating differently. But when it comes to that, like, because it's so dynamic in the experience, and it changes for each client, I always put it up to a split test.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think like the one thing on my end that I'll add, it's just like, depending on your audience size, like if you have a super small audience, like let the thing go. Either like combine it with your prospecting and go full funnel, or just like as big of an audience as you can. Just my 2 cents. I've been out of the game for a little bit. But to the next one here, Kim asks, and Kim, we got to catch up. But Kim asks, as a video producer, my team implements the tactics of creating content that align with the creative strategy that she develops. Like, can we speak on the types of video content that perform well on paid social?
Yeah, I mean, right now, we're seeing pretty strong impacts from influencer and lifestyle creative. That tends to do very well. It has, at least for a certain amount of time now, I'd say at least for a past year, like those lifestyle videos, those lifestyle shots, and things that just seem authentic to the brand, right? It's not too salesy. It's not pushing people in or down too far, especially when we're thinking of prospecting and the brand. It's really like lifestyle focused. And that's where it's like you can cut and pay, like cut those videos to 15 seconds to 30 seconds and see which one's working better in different time frames. So video content wise, I still really lean on lifestyle, and then really tapping into different statics or even maybe some short clips of like product focused ads, and using those in different parts of the funnel as well, right? So maybe you have a product specific ad for retargeting, some lifestyle video and prospecting, and you're just trying to figure out which works at different part of the funnels. But for the most part, I do find lifestyle does very well. I know influencer has been working pretty well as well, and there's a lot of great stuff going on in that influencer landscape where anything that makes the brand just seem more authentic is really resonating right now from what I've seen.
Most definitely. And Kim, this is why we got to catch up, because I think like when we start to distill what could work, like in the video world, especially as a video producer, Josh had mentioned it earlier, but it's that thumb stop ratio, which is really looking at how many people watch the first 3 seconds in thumbnail of whatever you produce, right? So that's where you can have quick cuts. TikTok style is really like in right now, but there's a lot of opportunity on that one too. And as we look at the next one here, so Rahul asked, how do you go about creative iteration if something is working on the testing campaign? So this is, yes, go ahead.
I love this because we hadn't gotten to this yet, and I wanted to bring this up. So when we're talking about evergreen versus create, like the testing, or what I'll call a sandbox campaign, right? So what I'm looking for is in my evergreen campaigns and what I'm running in there, that stays consistent, right? Like we don't want to be swapping out creative all the time in there and pausing things down every single, like, and putting a new creative in the evergreen, right? Because we know that the algorithm and the AI tools function better as more data flows in and it's less disrupted. So what I like to do is in the evergreen campaigns, that's really your stabilization, right? Like that's what stabilizes the account and efficiencies and really is driven towards that bottom line kind of goals. And in there, you're slowly phasing out ads, right? So, let's say you have about 3 to 5 or maybe 3 to 6 ads per audience in there, and I guess it depends also how much you're spending as well, but you have those 3 to 6 ads kind of running, right? And then in the testing sandbox, you are maybe testing in let's just call it creative test A, right? Or creative ad set test A. And in there's 3 different ads, and you're spending, maybe $100 a day against it, seeing where that money is flowing into. If spend starts to go towards a specific ad and it's not performing well, which we do see happen from time to time, pause it down, right? And I usually give it about $500 to $1,000 in spend. If it's not performing well, I'll pause it down. And then I'll watch to see if latent conversions trickle in. And then trying to give the other creative variations in there some opportunity to spend against. And then what I'll do is, say you find one that's working really well, right? In creative ad set A, where you're testing those 3 different ones. What I'll do is I'll pull that specific creative that's doing really well. First thing I want to do with it is I want to try and scale it if it's above like a benchmark goal of like a return on ad spend of 3. Say this ad's getting a 5, or this ad set has like a 5 return on ad spend. I'm going to put a little juice to that, right? So that's where that testing budget can vary from 10 to 30%. I want to see if this thing scales before I put it into evergreen. So then if it continues to do well after scaling, and it's still performing well and still above that ROAS goal of like a 3, I'll take that creative and then I'll go into the evergreen ad set that I'm going to be putting it into, and I'll phase out the bottom performer there, right? So maybe one that's just not been performing well, has been cannibalizing spend, and it's under a goal. I'll pause that one down and I'll put in the new testing variation that's shown that it could scale and has had strong performance in that sandbox. So that's kind of the approach to it, is like your evergreen, you're not doing those creative sprints. You're not phasing in new creative every week or every day. You're really continuing to stabilize the things that work. And then phasing out underperformers over time and phasing in new things that are working. So for that, like that's the way that I've found that's been working really well. And especially in this like post iOS landscape, it's very minimal at disrupting your, algorithm in regards to your evergreen status. So that's where it's like that 80-20% split. The 80% is focused on keeping the efficiencies in play, and the 20%, that's going to be a little rocky with performance because it's a testing environment, right? And I think setting those expectations, whether it's with clients, internal stakeholders, and this is where like we partner with our performance creative teams, is like when a client's using performance creative, we want to make sure they have a dedicated budget to testing for those purposes.
Amazing. So with time, we're looking at 4 minutes left. We probably have time for like one more question. So to pick through, hopefully we can get a good one here. There's some that tie together, but one that Andrew asked is like, how do you think through your creative strategy, your media buying and landing pages? And what he'd love is like an example, meaning ads header copy matches the same header that's on the landing page variant. So how's that process look like on your end?
Yeah, I would say when I'm going through that, I want to make it a holistic experience, right? So our creative strategy should match like the copy that we're doing, and there should be a symbiotic relationship between how like the message on a creative shouldn't vary significantly from what the body copy is talking about on the ad, and it shouldn't vary differently from the landing page experience. Like if you have a very like disruptive, like the creative saying one thing, the body copy saying another, and the landing page is going to something completely different, it's going to be a poor customer experience.
Perfect. Okay. And then I think hopefully we can squeeze in a couple, but I just want to tack on to Rahul's his previous question there. So we were talking about the iteration and the approach you walked through there. One thing he followed up with was related to the creative sprint cycle. Like how long are you typically looking at running that cycle for? And is it dependent on budgets more than anything?
This is great because it answers another question in the chat too that I can tackle with this. Creative sprints, usually they're based on budgets. I try to give everything at least 2 weeks before I cap it. And if the creative's doing well and it's above goal in that testing and sandbox campaign, there's no need to pause it, right? Because like if it's working in there, that's why that testing budget can vary from 10 to 30%. So say you're testing your sandbox, there's a ad set in there that's consistently above a 5. Keep putting money behind it, right? Keep pushing that creative because it's found the audience it's resonating with and it's working there. Drop it into evergreen too, but continue to let that thing ride in the sandbox too and keep that thing flowing. Like, so timing wise, it definitely depends on like budgets, right? Because like if you have a testing, like let's say you're testing with like you only have about like $1,000 a week maybe to test against creative, that might take 2 to 4 weeks rather than 1 to 2 weeks. So it varies on budget, is the big thing. But I try to give everything at least, depending on like what the budgets normally are. I try to make sure that each ad will get like, you know, roughly $500 to $1,000 in spend before I totally like phase it out. But yeah, the big thing is like if it's working in the sandbox, that's why I try to keep those testing budgets at least fluid of like what I could scale up with. Keep that thing humming.
Amazing. Amazing. Look at that timing. Perfect. 1 minute left. And I think what we're going to do is just call it here on the time. What we're
Yeah.
going to do after this one is we're going to send out the recording. Any question that was unanswered, everybody look out for that follow-up email. It will include answers to that question. We'll make sure of it. But Josh, man, while everyone's here, thank you so much. The guru himself. Always good catching up with you. Always great to hear your responses and just like hear your opinions. So I'm really happy you did this with us. So happy.
Of course. Evan, thanks for having me. This has been fun. You know, I love talking about this. It's definitely like right up my wheelhouse. So it was a pleasure to be here, and thank you for inviting me. And thank you everyone for joining as well and taking time out of your busy days. And hopefully this was super helpful.
Amazing. Thank you, everybody. There will be more stuff coming. Of course, just stay in our wheelhouse and we'll show you exactly what we're about. And have a great day or have a great night wherever you are in this part of in whatever part of the world you are in. Talk to you soon.
Bye, everyone.
Cool.